Yo, what's going on, everybody? Hopefully, everyone can hear me and see me. And welcome to Midweek Study Hall. So, if you're here and you can hear me and see me and everything, please let me know. I had to do something a little different with the audio again today. So, hopefully, it sounds all right, but I will get back to business as usual on Sunday. So, basically, the long and short of everything is I need batteries, and I went to the store yesterday and completely blanked on the fact that I needed to get some batteries. So that's what's going on with the with my normal audio setup. All right. So thank you guys for joining. Today is Midweek Study Hall, which is an extension of a weekly Bible study. If it's your first time here, my name is Phillip Godfrey, and thank you so much for joining and joining with us. If you're watching it later, thanks so much for taking the time out of your schedule to watch Bible study and also midweek study hall. So, midweek study hall and weekly Bible study are built off of the scripture in Matthew 6:33, where here the Bible tells us, the Messiah tells us to seek ye first the kingdom of the Father and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you. So, we gather here right now, it's twice weekly. We gather to see, seek, and serve the kingdom of the Father. All right. And so, as part of our assignment this year, we're walking through the entirety of the Bible, book by book and chapter by chapter. And it's a study series that we've entitled From Creation to Revelation. So, we'll be continuing that study today. So, if it's your first time here, stick around with us. And thanks so much again. Oh yeah, this is our first time going live for midweek study hall. So thank you guys who are watching live and jumping on. And I know that that was like a last minute type situation. So thank you so much for that and taking the time out of your day to do this. Probably ain't working too hard, no way. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about nobody. But let's go ahead and jump in. All right. So today for midweek, what we'll be looking at is the book of Nehemiah. For those that joined on Sunday, we finished up. We looked at the entirety of the book of Ezra, and today we'll be looking at the entirety of the book of Nehemiah. So before I start, I always give background. So let's jump into some of the background of the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah and Ezra were originally one book that was written together. They were one book, and they were broken out when they became part of the canon, when they canonized the Bible. And so this was originally one book, Ezra and Nehemiah put together, but the book of Nehemiah really continues the historical aspect from the time of Ezra. And is recapping a lot of the same time period. So I don't know if you remember last week or Sunday when we started, but one of the things we discussed was that Ezra talks about the Babylonian, the exile, and them, the Jews returning from Babylonian exile, and they came out in three waves. We looked at two of those waves in the book of Ezra. Was Zerubbabel leading the first wave of Jews out of captivity, and then after Zerubbabel, we see Ezra leading a group out to kind of furnish the home of the Father. Zerubbabel's assignment was to rebuild the home, rebuild the temple. And now what we will see with Nehemiah is a third kind of exodus from Babylonian captivity by the Jews back into Jerusalem. And their assignment, Nehemiah's assignment, is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And I think we talked about that a little bit when we were looking at, I think it's Ezra chapter 4 or chapter 6, one of those, but we were looking at when it's talking about the opposition that they ran into when they were building the temple of the Father, and how it gives a little excerpt there where it's talking about when they were building the walls, they were running into some opposition as well. And we'll see much of that opposition here in the book of Nehemiah as we walk through the entirety of it today. And additionally, one last theme is that Ezra really, since Ezra was a priest, and Nehemiah was the governor of the nation of Judah at the time. The book of Ezra really focuses on things from a more spiritual standpoint and a reconciliation back to the Father from a spiritual standpoint. And in Nehemiah, what we see is more of a governmental or political type approach to the writing of the book. Much of the book is written, well, not much, but a lot of the book is written in the first person. So even though they believe that Ezra wrote both of these books along with the Chronicles, they believe that these were taken, like they were written from Nehemiah's personal journal or something along those lines. All right. So hopefully everybody is on board with all of that, and we're going to jump into the study. All right, so let's start at chapter 1. So chapter one really begins by introducing us in Nehemiah. This is different than what we saw in Ezra because the book of Ezra doesn't introduce Ezra until chapter seven. But here Nehemiah is introduced to us right off the bat, and it sets the timeline for us almost immediately. So during this time, Nehemiah was he was Artaxerxes, who was the Persian king. We saw a little bit about Artaxerxes in the book of Ezra, but he was serving in Artaxerxes' home as the cupbearer, as his cupbearer, or similar to like a butler, what we would know a butler to be. And so Nehemiah is operating in that position. And the text says that Hanani, his brother, comes and with some of the men of Judah, and they tell Nehemiah what's going on with the Jews that have left captivity and how they were living in the city of Jerusalem at the time. And so it also, his brother tells him, these men tell him about how much affliction they're in, the Jews were in, how the walls of the city of Jerusalem are still broken down, how the gates are burned with fire, because we know that Nebuchadnezzar tore down the wall, and then set the gates on fire when he came and took the Jews into captivity. And so they were really just updating Nehemiah on what's going on. And so this update from his brothers leads Nehemiah into a season of fasting and prayer where he entreats the father. He petitions the father to allow his ear, the father's ear, to be attentive to the prayer of his servants, the people of Judah, and to prosper them and grant them mercy in this season. And so let's look at the beginning of that prayer in verse 5. All right. And verse 5 says, and I'm reading from the King James Version. So verse 5 says this, and said, Nehemiah speaking, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. So what we see here is that as Nehemiah begins this prayer, one of the first things he does is he anchors the conversation with the father with the fact that he's a father who keeps covenant and he's a father who shows mercy to his people. This is important because we know that the father has made a covenant with the children of Israel that they have transgressed, but the father has said that that covenant is everlasting and he will continue to operate along the lines of that covenant and in the guardrails of that covenant during this season and with his chosen people, the Jews and the Israelites. So we see that the covenant here is of great importance. And Nehemiah anchors this conversation with the fact that the father is not only in covenant with them, but he is a father who keeps covenant, that this covenant will continue to speak on their behalf. And he's approaching him with the reality and the truth that we are in a covenantal agreement. And that is anchoring their conversation. That brings him his position, his place of right standing in this season. And so here Nehemiah is also acknowledging the fact that his ancestors, the people of Judah, had walked away from the commands that the father had made, that they had been scattered for those reasons. But even though in that season, even though they had done these things, there was still a covenant that they had with the father. And as we move into chapter 2, we see the father begin to answer the prayer that Nehemiah made to him in chapter 1 when he heard about the status of his brethren in the nation of Judah at the time. And so shortly after this prayer, we see Nehemiah is serving in his role. He's serving the king, Artaxerxes, in his role as cupbearer. And Artaxerxes notices that his countenance is sad, that his nature is sad, that he just looks sad. And the text says that that had never been his reality in the presence of the king. So the king had never seen him sad before. And so now the king sees him sad. He asked him what's going on, and Nehemiah tells him that he's sad because the city of Jerusalem, the city of his ancestors, the place where his fathers are buried, his ancestors are buried, etc., still a place of destruction, that the walls are still torn down, that the gates are still burning. These things are weighing on him. And so after a bit more conversation, Artaxerxes permits Nehemiah to take leave from his position as cupbearer and to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall of the city. All right. So here we see the father's answer through Nehemiah being granted the opportunity to go back into the city and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah does just that. The king gives him some like some royal command, like a royal decree, or what's it called when it's written down. But anyway, he gives him like a royal document. Thank you, Holy Spirit. He gives him a royal document of his assignment, of his orders, and so that if anyone stops him along the way, they will know that he's actually on assignment from the king. He finally makes it to Jerusalem. He spends some time there, and then before he tells anyone of the assignment that he is there on, he secretly inspects the wall to determine what type of shape it was actually in. I guess he goes there to verify everything that his brother Hanani and the others had shared with him. The other leaders had shared with him when they came to him. So he inspects the wall, he sees what type of shape it's in, and then after this, he meets with the leaders and he tells them the assignment from the Father. He tells him that the Father has assigned him the opportunity to rebuild the wall, and that the King has blessed this assignment as well. The people of Judah, according to the text, are excited and encouraged and strengthened to complete the work of the wall, and they get to doing just that. Let's look at verses 17 and 18. All right. And here we have Nehemiah talking to the leaders. Then said I unto them, ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he has spoken unto me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. So we see here that Nehemiah and this assignment reinfused strength and just reinvigorated the people to do the work. But they're doing the work, they're getting going on rebuilding the walls. But we know, as we saw in Ezra, this does what? It brings out some haters. So now he Nehemiah is also dealing with a group of haters led by a young man named I don't know if he's young, but a gentleman by the name of Sanballat. And so I'm hoping I'm saying his name right, but I'm gonna say Sanballat. And so Sanballat comes, and these leaders, they come and they ask the people and ask Nehemiah what they were doing and why they were rebelling against the king, not knowing that they were actually being obedient to the Father, and the king was on their side. And so this is Nehemiah. We're going to look at verse 20 to see Nehemiah's response to Sanballat and these people coming up against them and trying to stop the work. We talked about that at length on Sunday, so I'm not going to go into too much depth there. But verse 20 says this. Then answered I them, Nehemiah, and said unto them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. So basically, what he's telling them is that this ain't got nothing to do with you. Mind your business. Go back over to your position, your place where you're supposed to be at. This ain't got nothing to do with you. You in our territory, and we have an assignment from the Father, and he will prosper us. Let this be encouragement to you today, that if you have an assignment from the Father and you see that something, anything, any institution, let's just pray. This is what I would pray. This is me personally. I'm just giving you insight into how I pray this scripture. Father, any person, any organization, any institution, any relationship, anyone, anything that is oppressing or seeking to oppress the assignment that you have for me in this season, I pray, Father, and decree that they have no portion, no right, no memorial in this promised land that you've given me, in this place that you set me. And I ask, Father, that you, and I decree unto those things that you will prosper me, because that's what the text says, that the God of heaven will prosper them. And that is what they stood on. And the text says right after that, the servants arose. It says, therefore, because we believe this, therefore it means that everything that we happened to said before that, this is like the consequence of it. But therefore, his servants, we will arise and build, because we believe that the Father will prosper us. So continue building, even in the oppressing seasons, even in the times where things are coming against you. Continue building, because the Father, that is your evidence. That is evidence that you believe that the Father will prosper you. Let me get off of that. Let me keep going. All right. So, and I keep looking up here because my camera is usually up here, but it's right here. So give me a little time to get reacclimated. Okay. And so let's move into chapter 3. So in chapter 3, we see the rebuilding of the wall begins formally, and it tells us chapter 3 details all the men who are completing the rebuilding of the temple of the gate. I mean, not the temple, the walls of Jerusalem and the gates, and it tells us their specific assignment. So it tells us that, like in verse 1, it says that the priest, they built the sheep gate. Then verse 8 says like Uzziel did the work of the goldsmiths, and then somewhere else it says that this person built like Jericho. So it's telling us like who, where the people were working and the assignments that they had in that time. This moves us back into chapter 4, where we see that Sanballat now sees that he did the first attempt that they had. It didn't stop their progress. Okay. It didn't slow them down. It didn't stop the work that they were doing. And he comes back, him and his people come back to mock them this time and to seek to stop the work again, to continue trying to oppose them. I keep saying oppress. I meant oppose. My bad. To oppose them. And so Sanballat, they come and they mock him. They come and they talking bad about him. One of the people who was with Sanballat, his name is Tobiah. He was even like, I mean, don't worry about it. Like a fox could walk by and the wall will fall down. That little wall they building ain't about nothing. And that's, I mean, that's what people are saying about you. A lot of times I feel like we think that the Bible so like so long ago and so far fetched, and that these things don't happen. But there are people right now who are talking about you and I. Let me talk about myself. There are people right now, I'm not gonna talk about me, but there are people right now who are talking about you and I, saying that little thing they building ain't it ain't about nothing, no way. I could come over, I could build some way bigger than them, and this, that, and the third. And they look at them, they halfway doing it anyway. That part got a hole in it. They ain't fixed that leak over there, and this, that, and the third. That's what the people were saying. That is what they were doing to these people, trying to get into their mind and trying to get them to hear something that didn't align with what they had heard from the Father, so that they could do something that didn't align with the actions that were required from what the Father had told them to do. And so don't let what people are talking or saying about your assignment and the season that you are in, because guess what? They just started building the wall. So yeah, it don't look like a complete project yet. It don't look like a complete product yet. Thank you, Holy Spirit. It don't look like a complete product yet. But guess what? If they keep building and they don't let what everybody else saying about them affect them, guess what? It will be a complete product. So don't be afraid to continue building as long as you're doing in obedience. All right. So anyway, so Sanballat and his crew, they coming and they opposing them again. And in verse 5, Nehemiah, we see that Nehemiah hears these things and he goes into prayer, asking the Father. He asked the Father to turn the reproach of these oppressors, to turn their approach on their own head. This is his prayer. I don't know if we should pray things like that. That's something that you can, figure out on your own. But to turn the reproach of these oppressors on their own head and turn them over into captivity into their own land, because they provoked the workers of the Father to come to stop. They provoked the workers to stop completing his assignment, and led them and tried to get them over into anger. Anyway, the long and short of it here is that we see that the work continues again. This also, the fact that they didn't stop work again, upset Sanballat again and his crew. And this time their plan is that they're going to come up and attack. They're going to get an army. They're going to come up and attack the city to get the work to stop. But again, we see here Nehemiah learns of this plan, this plot, and he goes forth and he prays and he sets forth divine instructions on how to guard the city and continue to building the work at the same time. Let's look at that in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 4. And Nehemiah says, and I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not ye afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses. And it came to pass, when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and that God had brought their counsel to naught. That means that God had brought their plan to nothing. The plan that they had, he had completely squashed it. That we return all of us to the wall, everyone unto his work. So we see here that their plan, their plot against them again, this time was stopped once again, and they go away this time for a little while and stop trying to fight against them essentially. But this didn't stop Nehemiah from keeping his guard up, just being aware that the opposition was there and that the oppressors were seeking to stop the work. So from that time forward, Nehemiah had half of the workers act as armed guards, and the other half continued to work on the wall. So anytime they were working on the wall, half of the people were standing there with swords and spears, and ready to battle, and the other half of the people were completing their assignment on the wall. And the text says that additionally, in addition to this, all of the workers, kept a sword at their side continually, whether they were actually completing their assignment or on guard. They kept a sword at their side, so they were always ready. And if they heard the trumpet, they were to rally to be ready to fight. All right. As we move into chapter 5, we see chapter 5 begins by um, with the people of Judah coming to Nehemiah. We see Nehemiah really governing and shifting the nature of the nation here a little bit. And so chapter 5 begins with the people of Judah coming to Nehemiah and telling him about the tough situation they were in financially. They were telling the leaders that they needed more food and more provisions to live off of, because there was like a famine, and because things just weren't, they were coming out of captivity into this new place and seeking to live on their own again. And so they just needed more. And they said that they needed more food and provisions due to the sizes of their families as well. And so they go on to tell Nehemiah how they were unable to buy more food because they had already mortgaged their homes. So we see here their mortgages were punitive in this season. We're not talking about that today, but they had already mortgaged their homes. It said they had already mortgaged their lands and their farms and their vineyards. It says that they had already sold their children into slavery. They had already done these things, and so there was little hope. They were telling him that they had little hope of their situation ever turning around. They had little hope of ever redeeming their children from slavery and from the captivity that they had sold them in, because they couldn't gain traction financially. And one of the reasons that they couldn't gain traction financially, it was because of interest. And so Nehemiah is upset about this, understandably, and he goes and he talks to the financial leaders of the time, and he rebukes them for how they were treating their own people. So these are other Jews, or these are other Israelites that are in a leadership position and handling the financial arena, and here they are charging the people such a rate that they can't even overcome it. They can't even get back on their feet. They can't even feed their families. And so Nehemiah goes to them and he rebukes them. And so finally, they agree to return all the land and the assets to the people, and to pay back the interest that was paid to them, and that they would not do these things again. This is interesting to me because this practice continues to this day. Those of what we would consider Jewish heritage, they do not charge interest to other Jewish people. And it also is a practice in the Muslim faith. I don't know about any other belief system, but I know in the Muslim belief system, if they are truly living a haram life, that they do not pay interest as well. They do not. Their belief system does not allow them to pay interest. And so this is something that continued forward long after it was shown us here. And so they completely got rid of all the interest. They paid back the interest that they paid, and they returned all the land and assets unto them. And the chapter closes with Nehemiah sharing that during his reign as governor, he was governor of Judah. So a governor would similar to what we've already talked about. Um, Artaxerxes was the king, and technically Artaxerxes still had rule over this area, the nation of Judah. And so, and the physical land territory of Judah as well. And so Artaxerxes would set a governor, or would set a leader over over that territory to kind of promote his interest and keep all the people in line, and those different types of things. So Nehemiah was that. It would be similar to a governor here, how we have in the United States. At least we have a president, then we have a governor. The only difference is that the governors here are elected by the people, or so they say. And so the governors then would have just been appointed. And so like the governor for the state you live in, that's their responsibility. And it would have been very similar. So hopefully that makes sense how all that works. So Nehemiah was governor. His first period as governor, he was governor for 12 years. And the text tells us that during that time, he never used his food allowance from the king because he understood that the people were already stretched thin financially and they're already burdened with their finances. And so what that looked like is that even though the king would give the governor a portion that came from the finances and like the taxes or the tributes that the people paid to the king annually. And so what Nehemiah was saying or doing was like it's not placing an extra burden on the people from the king so that if the people didn't have the money to pay, it was fine. And so the text goes on to tell us as it closes out that he fed 150 people at his table of his own ability without laying additional burden on the people. And so as the chapter ends, we see that he has this request of the Father. This is one of the things that I think is funny about Nehemiah. What we see Nehemiah doing, even though it was very much he's like highlighting his works and asking the Father to remember his works and not hold his works against him. And so I just love that to remember his works and to give him what his works deserve. So I just think that that's interesting. I know that that's not how we operate today at all, because we're not saved by works or anything, but our works don't validate us. But it's interesting to see how Nehemiah is always putting the Father in remembrance of the things that he's done. And as we look at verse 19, it says this: "Think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people." Let's move into chapter 6, okay? Yeah. So chapter 6, we see that there's opposition continuing to come for the building of the city walls. Here, Sanballat is back again, and they continue to try to stop the work. This time, Sanballat reaches out to Nehemiah directly. He sends a messenger and requests a meeting with him, a face-to-face meeting with him. The text says that Nehemiah realized that this was like a front, that he was trying to actually harm him or kill him. So Nehemiah refuses the meeting, citing the fact that he's in the middle of a great work, and why should he stop that work to come and meet him? This is interesting, and I believe this is a response that we should have more often than we do. It's telling people, no, I'm in the middle of doing something, and I can't come off of that thing to meet with you or to spend time with you or to stand or to come away from that thing for any period of time at this time. And so I like that Nehemiah told him that. But Sanballat is persistent. He reaches out to him 4 more times after that, and Nehemiah refuses his request all of those times. Lastly, he reaches out to him with a note, and he tells him that he sends a messenger. He says, "Hey, I'm gonna tell." I've heard Nehemiah. I mean, Sanballat says, we've heard that there are rumors going around that the reason that you're rebuilding the wall is so that you can rebel against the king, and that you Nehemiah are working to set yourself up as king of Judah. And he was just saying like he would hate for this to get back to Artaxerxes, basically threatening him, blackmailing him, all those different types of things to get him to actually meet with him. But Nehemiah responds that it is all a lie. And you have to really think about the strength that it took for Nehemiah not to go at this point in time. Nehemiah has a very close relationship with Artaxerxes. It wouldn't have been far-fetched with some work that Nehemiah is doing here. It wouldn't have been far-fetched that Artaxerxes could have believed that he was trying to set himself up as king again, especially as we saw previously where they had searched the records and seeing that this was a city of insurrection. This was a city that they considered bad. And so it took a lot of belief and faith and strength for Nehemiah to refuse these things and to push back on Sanballat, because these aren't far-fetched. This is not something hard to believe about what he was doing at the time. But Nehemiah responds to him, says that it's all a lie, and he immediately prays to the Father that the Father would strengthen him so that the work could continue. And I believe this is an important part that we can miss sometimes. When we run into opposition and things like that, we're like, oh man, what is this person gonna think about it? They're gonna think I'm doing the wrong thing or this, that, and the third. Instead of getting caught up in that, which we often do. I know I've been guilty of doing that. That instead of getting caught up with that, we immediately go to the Father and say, hey, I need your strength in this area so that I need you to show me strong in that area so that I can continue the work that you've given me to do over here. Okay. And so hopefully that makes sense and lands on who it needs to land on. So after this, Sanballat even goes even further. So Nehemiah has refused him 5 times now of meeting with him. And so now Sanballat and Tobiah, they hire a priest or a prophet in Judah, and they try to use the prophet to trick Nehemiah into going into the house of the father and sinning, and that way he would have essentially an open door. It would give him a reason to go, and the father to come against him. But Nehemiah perceived that the prophet was trying to trick him, and he didn't go into the father's house. So let's look at that. And then Nehemiah prays that the father will remember all the people who worked so hard to oppose him and stop the assignment. Let's look at that in verses 12 and 13, okay, of chapter 6. And lo, I perceived that God had not sent him. So this is Nehemiah saying he perceived that the father wasn't the one who was actually speaking through this prophet at the time, that God had not sent him, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me, for Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Therefore he was he hired, that I should be afraid and do so and sin, and that they might have matter for evil report, and that they might reproach me. And so this is something just in my own personal life that really stood out to me as I was reading this week. Is like some of the things that have come up against you are verse 13 here. Nehemiah said this, therefore was he hired. Therefore is this thing come against you, that you should be afraid. It's trying to make you afraid. Because once we get afraid, we begin to operate out of fear. And once we make fear-based decisions, we're already sliding down a slippery slope. And so that thing that has come up against you the enemy has sent it to try to get you afraid. And it said, and do so. So it means to do the thing that the father has told you not to do, to go back and do that thing, or to not believe what the father has said and sin. Now you have brought sin into your situation. And because of this, that opposition, that institution, that thing that was hired, that person that was hired, that thing that is opposing you, now the enemy has an evil report against you and is able to reproach you because you've opened the door through the fear and really giving over into that thing. And so spend some time with verse 13 here and just see if it applies to your life in any situation. So as chapter 6 ends, we see that the wall was finished in 52 days. And at this point, the oppressors are sad. They're frustrated because they realize that the father was actually the one who had given them this work to do, and that he was actually working with them to get it completed in such a timely manner. All right. Let's move into chapter 7. Chapter 7 really just recaps the first census that takes place, because what happened was, or the first census that took place in Ezra chapter 2, I believe, was Zerubbabel. The reason that it's doing this is because Nehemiah realized that the city of Jerusalem was very large and spacious, but the population was still very small. Remember, when they took that census over in Ezra chapter 2, there were only about 43,000, or a little less than 43,000 or so Jews that came out of captivity back into the territory, the city of Jerusalem. This is very far population wise from what we saw in Exodus when they first came out of Egypt, and they were numbered, and it was millions of the people at one point. And now there are only 40,000 or so that have come back into the city. So the city is very large, and he realizes that. And so I believe he wanted to know, it doesn't specifically tell us, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that Nehemiah wanted to know who was in the city and like kind of what people weren't there and different things like that. So he goes back and he reconciles all the people who are in the city to that census data from Ezra chapter 2, and to that and to the genealogical records and everything. And then in verse 2, we see that his brother Nehemiah made his brother governor over the land once the wall was built and once the doors were set up, and then that people, they were set back into their appointed positions. The reason that he did this is because Nehemiah's assignment was to build the wall and to set back up the gates, and that's what he had told Artaxerxes. And so once Nehemiah completed that assignment, he was no longer the governor of Judah. He returned back to serving in his position as cupbearer, or in Artaxerxes. I don't know if he was the cupbearer again, but he returned back to serving in Artaxerxes' kingdom or palace or whatever. He returned back to that assignment. So there was a period of time in the book of Nehemiah. And during this time period that we're looking at historically, that Nehemiah wasn't the governor. And then what we'll see in chapter 13 is that Nehemiah returns and he does become the governor again. All right, let's move into chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins, we see Ezra and the leaders of Judah gathering to teach the people the word of the Father as it is found in the book of the law. And then he ultimately causes the people to not just hear the word, but to have an understanding of the word as well. This is important because as we know, the people have they come out of captivity. So they have spent a great period of time, 70 plus years or so. They spent that period of time not really diving into the instructions of the Father because they were in a foreign land. And a lot of us, maybe if you live in the United States, we don't think about things like this because we are able to have freedoms and such. But in this time period, if they were under the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon or Persia or whatever, they would have not been able to operate in their Hebrew heritage. They would have had to operate, even though they were Hebrews, they would have had to operate as captives, or as like I don't say bolt on, but like bolt on Persians or something like that, or just Babylonians. And so this is where we get like the mixing of the belief systems and how so much like Babylonian, like um what's it called, like traditions and different things get mixed into the culture of the Jews and what we would consider now Christians. They get mixed in together because of the muddying of the water that takes place. Because the reality is, and this still happens today in war, a tactic of war is that once you capture a people, and especially an entire nation of people, you wipe out their history, you wipe out their heritage, and now you oppose your history on them and your belief systems on them. And that's the same thing that was going on here. Let's read verses 1 through 3, and then we'll get back on that conversation. Verses 1 through 3 here in chapter 8. And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate. And they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and women, and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. And he read therein before the street that was before the water gate from the morning until midday, before the men and women and those that could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. So now what they're doing is reinfusing the father's culture into the people, the father's instruction, and ultimately like the father's constitution. Like if this is a kingdom and this is the father's the king, so they're reinfusing his decrees into the people and into the assignment that they should be completing. And so that is what they were doing by reading the law and then understanding it and ultimately doing it. So after this, afterwards in the text, we see the nation gathering to observe the Feast of the Booths, as written, a Feast of Booths, which is written as is written in the book of the law in Leviticus. And so it says that this is the first time that the nation had observed this feast since the time of Joshua. So this just shows us how far away, how far removed they had gotten from keeping the fullness of the law and keeping the fullness of the commandments that they have been given by the Father. Let's read verses 16 through 18, and then we'll move into chapter 9. So the people went forth and brought them and made themselves booths, everyone upon the roof of his house and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the street of the water gate, and the street of the gate of Ephraim, and all the congregation of them that were come again out of the captivity made booths and sat under the booths. So booths are like tents. And so the reason that they were supposed to keep the Feast of Booths is as a reminder for how the Father kept them when they were dwelling in tents in their journey from Egypt into the Promised Land. And where was I at? Yes, verse 17, halfway. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun, until that day had not the children of Israel done so. And there was very great gladness. So these people were glad again. They were full of joy again. They were excited again to be able to keep the instructions of the Father. Also, day by day, verse 18, from the first day until the last day, he read in the book of the law of God, and they kept the feast 7 days. And on the 8th day was a solemn assembly according unto the manner. So we see now that Ezra is leading the charge and reinfusing the word of the Father, the commandments of the Father, and the law into the nation of the Father's chosen people, Judah and Israel. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 begins As it begins, we see that the nation was gathered together again for the Feast of Booths, for a season of fasting and repentance. And that after this, they went into like confession for their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors and all those things. And so let's look at verses 1 through 3 of chapter 9. Now, the 24th day of this month, so it's the same month, the seventh month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and with sackcloth and earth upon them. So it just means they were in a season of fasting, mourning, kind of, yeah. Verse 2, and the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of their God 1/4 part of the day, and another fourth part they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. So we see that this is just a season of them drawing closer to the Father, drawing more deeper into relationship with the Father and with the Lord their God. They're spending time each day reading the word. They're spending time confessing. They're spending time worshiping. They're spending time repenting. And so after this, the Levites, they go, if you read the chapter, they go through and kind of remind the Father and the people, put them in remembrance of everything that has happened. They recap everything that has happened from Abraham up into their current place. So they go and they put them in remembrance of how the Father had been faithful during the time of Abraham, and how he um, they remind the people how how the Father chose Abraham because his heart was faithful before him, how the Father saw their affliction in Egypt and delivered them, how he met them at Sinai, provided manna for them along the journey, how they even continued to disobey, how they worship golden calves. But the Father continued to sustain them, and they lacked nothing. And eventually he led them over. He led them into the promised land, then gave them over to their enemies because of their disobedience and all these things. And how the Father had ultimately at this point heard their cries again and brought them out of captivity. And is now, because of his mercy and great and graciousness, he didn't consume them or cast them away as he desired to and as he could have. And so the Levites are putting them all, and the priests are putting them all in remembrance of these things as they are praying unto the Father. And so, and it's talking about the chapter ends, or towards the end of this prayer, they even tell the Father, and this is interesting to me, and it kind of makes me a little sad for them in their situation. But they talk about how even though now they are in the promised land, but they are servants in it. So think about that. Because of their disobedience, the thing that the Father had given as a blessing to them, they were now serving someone else in that same place, all because of decisions that they made. And so we want to make sure, how do I say this? Like, we want to make sure that our place of blessing doesn't become our place of captivity. And ultimately, after I had finished all of this led them to make a covenant with the Father to follow him. And we see the beginning of that in verse 38. And it says, and because of all this, we make a sure covenant and write it, and our princes, Levites, and the priests seal it. So they wrote this covenant down, and the covenant really was just, we see the details of the covenant in chapter 10, but the covenant was really just them coming back into agreement with the Father and to his word and to follow him. And the first few verses just kind of tell us who signed, of chapter 10, tell us who signed the document, who signed the document stating that they were agreed with the covenant. And then in 28, we began to see the details and the obligations of the covenant that they were making. All right, let's read verses 28 through 31 and just see some of those. Verse 28, and the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims were like temple slaves, or yes, temple servants, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of the Lord, of the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. They clave unto their brethren, the nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God. So they are making an agreement and a curse and an oath that they're going to walk. They're going to actually do what the law says, and do on what the instructions that the Father gave Moses said, and to observe to do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his judgments and his statutes, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. We talked about the intermarrying and things. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy them on the Sabbath or on any holy day, and that we would leave the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. And so here, the first few things that it talks about, just coming back into alignment with the Father's instructions. It talks about how they would not enter into alliances with unclean nations, or nations that are outside of the covenant of the Father. That's what it means by the giving of the daughters and sons. Talks about how they would start observing the Sabbath again. They would not buy or sell on the Sabbath. That was something that they had been doing, or any holy day, which was also considered a Sabbath. And it talks about the 7-year release. We talked about that a little bit, and it says the exaction of every debt. So that's part of the 7-year release. There was also like that was a release of debt in that year as well, but also in the Jubilee year, the 50th year, there was a release of debt and a return of assets back into the owner. So they're saying that they're coming back into alignment and doing those things. They also made ordinances about, as through the rest of the chapter, they talked about ordinances around annual dues or tributes for the house of the Father, to make sure that it was staying, everything was taken care of. They didn't need to be taken care of, repairs and different things. They talked about the requirements of the showbread, continual meat offering, first fruit offerings. It also tells them about tithes, and it says that they will not forsake the house of the Father. So that is what we see in chapter 10, the people of Judah entering back into covenant with the Father again. All right, let's move into chapter 11. Chapter 11, the summary is simple. All it tells us is that we just see the people settling, the settling of the people and where they ended up living, between being inside the walls, or inside like the city proper, or outside of the walls of the city. And so it goes and tells us like the Levites, or which of the Levites, which of the specific families, where they ended up and whatnot. You can go read that on your own if you want those details. Chapter 12, it starts with telling us the names of the Levites who returned to Jerusalem in the first wave, and then the names of all the priests that came to serve in the days of Nehemiah as governor as well. And then in verse 27 of that chapter, what we see is the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. And as part of that dedication, they call all the Levites from across the nation to assist with the procedures. And the text says that they dedicate the wall with gladness, thanksgiving, cymbals, and singing. So we see that joy has entered back into this land, where the prophecy of Jeremiah was that this land would be run over for 70 years and be bare and all these things. And there was another prophecy, I don't remember exactly who it was from, I think it was Elijah, but that people would walk by and they would hiss at the land. They would say, why has the temple look like this? Why the wall look like this? And they'll say, because these people had walked away from their father. So all these things, that they would become a byword and all these things. So all these things that have happened, we see out of all of that, there's joy now returning back into that same land, because the people have realigned themselves and come back into agreement with the Father. As the chapter ends, we see Nehemiah taking the leaders to the top of the wall. He organizes a large choir and they sing thanks unto the Father. And then the choir comes also into the house of the Father and sing praises there as well. Let's read verse 43 of chapter 12. Then we'll do chapter 13 and finish up. Chapter 12, verse 43 says, also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced. They rejoiced. That means they just had joy over and over and over and over again. For God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. So now they are a joyful people again. They're coming back into their joy. The Father is setting them in joy, and the joy is being heard. And the beauty of everything that the Father has done for them in this season is being heard even amongst the nations that are around them. All right, chapter 13. So in chapter 13, as I already told you, Nehemiah was the governor. He leaves and goes back and serves in his position with Artaxerxes. In chapter 13, we see him returning back, but it begins with the reading of the book of Moses, and they came into the place where the text forbids the Ammonite and the Moabite from entering into the congregation of the Father forever. It says this is a statute forever. And so when they heard this law, the text says they separated themselves from, and they separated all of those who were of mixed heritage from the people. And this is again, just we talked about this with the mass divorce over in Ezra. Like this is them. This is a nation that is doing some, I don't want to say desperate, but it's doing some, very large, like very challenging things and very large scale type things to get back into alignment with the Father. I'm not saying that we still have to do things like that. There are times where the Father will ask you to do very challenging, huge things. But here specifically, that is why they were doing these things, like getting rid of everybody who was mixed heritage, including their own children and different things. So I don't want to get too deep into that. After that, in the text, in the chapter, we see that the temple was cleansed because there was some pollution of the temple by Eliashib, the priest. He allowed Tobiah to have space in the temple while Nehemiah was gone. And so when Nehemiah returns, he cleans the temple and he gets rid of Eliashib and Tobiah. You can, do with that what you will. Kind of imagine how that happened. The chapter also sees the restoration of tithes, since the Levites and the priests once again were doing their work in the house of the Father, and they had not been receiving their prescribed portions of food while Nehemiah was gone. And then it goes on to tell about the requirement of Sabbath and how they are reestablishing that. And it goes as far as to say to make sure that they keep the Sabbath, that they closed the gates, because there were some people from foreigners who were kind of skirting around the process. They were still coming in or coming close, and people were on the Sabbath, and people were still buying and selling. So they just closed off the entirety of the city on the Sabbath. They closed the gates, and people were not able to enter or leave if they were in the city by a certain time. And so at the end of the chapter, what we see is we see again the forbidding of mixed marriages, similar to what we saw at the end of the book of Ezra, and people walking away from those things in order to be in alignment and obedience to the law of the Father. All right. So that's all I got for us today, guys, on midweek. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for joining live. And for those that stay a little bit, who will watch later, thank you guys for staying. I know it was a little bit longer of a midweek, but I did want to get through the entirety of this book. On Sunday, we'll be looking at the book of Esther in its entirety. So go ahead and read the book of Esther. It's going to be a great time. We're getting into the entire Bible is fun, but we're definitely getting into some fun kind of seasons of the Bible and some fun periods of the Bible. One other thing that's interesting to me, I said on Sunday, I'll say here, but from a historical standpoint, Nehemiah and Malachi are like the end of the historical aspect of the Bible. So as we get into these other books, we'll be looking back at many of the things that we went deep on in these first few books. So that'll be really cool to kind of tie it all together and see like Elijah and how he is, Isaiah and how he's prophesying over in the time of the kings, and then Jeremiah and how he's prophesying about this time in the Kings and the Chronicles and Obadiah and different things. So that'll be really fun to get there. So hang out with me, stay around with us. We're going to get through this text this year, because that is the assignment. And I'll see you guys on Sunday, 8 p.m. I love you. More important than that, the Father loves you. The Father loves you. Let him love you. Okay. Start before you're ready and don't stop. I'll see you guys next time.